Absolutely. Much more severe than a preference issue. So I'll have people that will sit down with their family and they literally won't eat anything, or they'll have to prepare an entirely different meal. So the family's having spaghetti, but they're absolutely terrified beyond terrified of carbs, and they'd feel horrifically guilty if they had them, and they're terrified of what it will do to their body, and then they'll lose their job, or, something really dramatic. And so instead they'll make themselves like, I'm going to have a piece of chicken and some broccoli.
If I'm listening to this and I know nothing of this field, it sounds completely irrational, totally off the reservation to hear somebody say, I'm terrified of carbs. Now, we've all probably had the experience where we have moderated our intake for one reason or another. This is not what we're talking about either. Explain terrified of food.
So think about something, Jake, that you are scared of. What are you scared of?
I'm afraid that I might actually be afraid of something. No, I'm just kidding.
We have a therapist for you.
I am terrified. I'm absolutely ridiculously terrified of yellow jackets, which is strange because we have a ton of them in our yard, and I try to be brave for my kids.
Right.
And I hang the yellow jacket traps, but they can't see that my heart is about to pound out my chest. Even I'm not allergic. I really just don't like. I've been stung with them before, and they hammer at you, and they sting you multiple times, and it's just really unpleasant. And I swear they're like little terrorist kamikaze yellow jackets that don't care who they sting or when, and they're totally arbitrary in their attacks. So I'm frightened of them.
Yes. So imagine now if a couple of things. Imagine if you refused to ever play with your kids in the backyard because there were yellow jackets out there. That's a life-interfering behavior, right?
Agreed.
Your kids are sad. They want you to come out. And so imagine now that 3 times a day you have to sit in close proximity to yellow jackets and touch them in some way. So this is what it feels like to have an eating disorder and be afraid of food, be afraid of certain types of food, and afraid of what that food is going to do to you.
What are the other disorders? We talked about the little texture one there that people might struggle with, where they have to create a brand new meal. But there's other types where you eat and then you barf, and then there's other types where you just don't eat at all, and then try to relax. Come on, peanut gallery.
Yes. Okay.
Amy, who's over there? Amy, introduce yourself from afar.
Can you hear me from back there?
Probably, if you speak up.
I'm Amy, Program Director of Thrive.
Yep.
That is all.
She came along for social media purposes, but she's the one cackling if you can hear it.
Yes.
And I'm trying to be light and fun and colloquial about a very serious topic, so I use the word barf instead of purge or vomit.
Via emesis. So what bulimia nervosa, we'll start there. It's incredibly common at some point, particularly with women, to struggle with bulimia in some way. Now, bulimia can manifest as many, many things.
What's incredibly common?
Bulimia to develop clinically,
percentage-wise, or how common?
Some studies estimate that there's about 1 out of 5 women that at some point in their life has had a clinically significant case of bulimia nervosa, diagnosable. So it's much more common. And I think this is partially outside rabbit trail for just a minute here. I think this is really, really common because food is such a social thing. And because right now what's really popular is to do things like talk about this new diet that you're on in the office. It's something that many, many people have in common. It's not a deep, vulnerable conversation. People like to talk about paleo a lot. They like to talk about, I lived for a long time in Berkeley. There they like to talk about your grass-fed organic turkey that you're going to have for Thanksgiving. But meanwhile, there's actually people that because of this topic of conversation, you're introduced to this idea constantly of, if I'm not like that, if I'm not doing those things, then in some way I don't belong.
Well, even just the separation of the ability to afford a different diet, whether or not it's fad, is quite discriminatory and classist in and of itself, right? So, because it takes a lot more money to find the grass-fed turkey. Do grass-fed turkeys exist? Do they don't even run on grass?
I made that up. I made that one up. I thought that was a good one. They don't run on grass.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know. They eat everything, I think. Yeah.
Seeds, yeah.
Seeds, yeah. So seed-fed turkey.
Point being, it's rare. And what is a rare commodity in the open market? Expensive.
Yep.
Because it's hard to find, presuming
got it.
there's a demand for it, right? So if all of a sudden there's this increased demand for these diets that have particular tags on them, non-GMO or organic or whatever it is, then demand increases, supply is whatever the supply is, price is going to go up. And so if it's suddenly trendy and all your friends are doing it and you can't because you're struggling with food relationship, that puts you on the outs.
Absolutely. So I think that's a huge part of it. But to go back to your original question, which was talk about the different types of eating disorders. So bulimia is really this pattern of you do restriction in public, essentially. So if you're eating food with your friends that you want to belong with, you're maybe not eating carbs, or you're eating things in a certain way that looks good.
And you can hide behind the diet.
Yes, you can hide behind the diet. Absolutely.
So they all order pizza and you go, I'll pick the pepperoni off.
Yeah, right.
I'm good. I'm just doing, I'm trying to be,
yeah,
a little
something like
punchy
that.
with it. Yeah.
Something like that. And so then when they leave, when you go home, you then order another large pizza and eat the whole thing in a very short period of time by yourself. And I'm picking a random thing.
Yeah,
It might not
Stick
be
with the metaphor.
yeah, that much. But then you engage in whatever your purging behavior is. So that could be emesis, or barfing, as Jake likes to say.
Ralphing.
Or that could be, I'm going to exercise for 3 hours right now. Or that could be, I'm going to use laxatives, or I'm going to go use Coke in the bathroom so that I'm up all night, so I burn this off.
Is cocaine prevalent, or is it amphetamines, methamphetamines, like
Totally. In Nevada,
any stimulant?
Yeah, Coke's making a comeback actually, but yes, amphetamines are very, very common in Nevada to use, particularly if you're wanting to restrict your food intake. And,
Well, it's an appetite suppressant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any sort of stimulant. Coffee's the most common one, though. So you'll often see people that drink coffee all day long and don't eat because it's an appetite suppressant.
That's why my barista is really thin.
Yeah.
No, just kidding.
No.
But yeah, true. I mean, if you're drinking coffee all day and you're ingesting stimulants, you're less likely to be hungry. Not only because you got fluid in your stomach, which sends a signal to the brain that you're full,
Right.
but also the caffeine itself. Wow. All right, so let's talk treatment.
Okay.
How do you attack this? Other than we've heard about the exposure, stick your hand in the bees or whatever.
Yeah.
Don't make me do that.
I won't.
And then there's the conversation about trauma, and I want to hover there for a second. Is there a presumption of trauma in most of these?
I think some people would say yes. I don't necessarily myself personally believe in presuming that. I think that often it is very, very common, and you should always screen for it if you have somebody with an eating disorder or any sort of anxiety disorder and depression. However, I would say about 50% of the time, it's a big T trauma. And when I say big T, I'm talking like...
An event, you mean?
A big event,
Okay.
right. Versus little T, which is like, things that we go through throughout the day that feel traumatic to us.
Okay, so big T versus little T, I want to stand there for a moment. Big T, assaults in the past, that kind of thing. Major, like, life-altering events. Could be one, could be multiple, exposure to terrorist attack, combat, whatever. Little T, and I'm looking at you and you're nodding and smiling like I'm on track.
Yeah.
Little T, bullying, childhood emotional neglect, maybe, like parents were both there but not super present.
Right.
That would be little T trauma. Now, what's non-trauma that might result in an eating disorder?
So the development of, and I mentioned this before, like an obsessive compulsive disorder. So a lot of that, or development of bipolar disorder with a little side of bulimia. So not little, I'm being glib, but so these are very genetically based disorders oftentimes. Like we know with, for example, with bipolar disorder, if you have one parent that's bipolar, you have a 25% chance of inheriting bipolar disorder. If you have two, you have a 50% chance of inheriting bipolar disorder. So these are very genetically based disorders. So not everything is based on trauma. So these often co-occur with eating disorders.
How do you attack the non-eating disorder? Because that's what we call them all in our language. They're all disorders.
You call them non-eating disorders?
No. for this conversation purposes. So you're talking about the eating disorder that's a spin-off of the other thing,
right?
Whatever it may be, and presumably we're attacking the other thing as well.
Absolutely.
and I want to make sure we're giving hope to the people who are like, hope is dimming when they hear something like genetic predisposition, because they're like,
scary.
oh no, I'm doomed for the rest of my life to struggle with this thing.
Yeah.
And I think, what I've been saying for a long time is, outside of some structural deficiency that we can track, like, in the brain or whatnot, if it's a true mental disorder, it's a true psychological disorder, then we can truly reroute to health. It is overcomable. Mental illness is overcomable. And I want to make sure that we're inspiring people to say that you're not doomed for the rest of your life simply because you had two parents who had bipolar disorder, and then you developed, a manic swing, and you're like, oh no, this is just the end for me. There's nothing I can do, right?
Yeah, no, it's very manageable. So I think that's the biggest thing to know about those disorders, is that they're very manageable, but you also need to be managing them. It's a necessity if you have that diagnosis to manage it. So what that looks like is typically medication and therapy. And we were talking about the differences between mental health versus physical health. This is another area where if your pancreas was not making insulin, these little islets of Langerhans in your pancreas stopped making insulin, then we would call that type 1 diabetes. And you probably wouldn't even think twice about going to see an endocrinologist and getting on insulin and making sure that you're managing your diet and going to a certified diabetes educator for that. But if you have, and there are some structural defects in the brain that we can know, but it's just another body organ. It's like, it's manageable. So we know that your brain has a structural defect, for example. So we then say, okay, well, let's manage that with medication and therapy, just like diabetes. It's no different. It's just another body organ.
How do we find those and confirm etiology? Make sure that it's not environment or nurture, as they say. It's nature. So it sounds like brain scans and RF imaging and all that stuff is very not RF. I'm sorry, fMRI imaging is very expensive, and not too many places do it. And so if we want to pin it down, and we're not just shooting in the dark, presuming that medication is working, and it's not something else that was you got two parents struggling with bipolar disorder, you're going to be prone to some mood swings. Can we come out of that at some point, or is it where do we pin it down? I guess, or do we, or
where do we
just
pin
whatever
down the disorder?
Yeah, like the origins of it.
And sometimes
or do we
that's
just
not
say
even
whatever's
necessary.
working for you is
right.
working?
Like I would say 90% of the people that develop type 1 diabetes don't know what the final straw was. Sometimes it was a virus, sometimes it was this, sometimes it was that. It's always something environmental that activates that biological switch. So that's the way I conceptualize it. It's biopsychosocial, right? So we have the biological component. So you inherit a propensity to develop maybe an eating disorder.
Great phrase. Yeah.
And then the environment does something somehow to flip that switch on to on with the propensity. Trauma is a great example of what could do that. And then the social environment sustains the disorder, because we talked about that, like the culture around food and those kinds of things. So let's switch back to eating disorders for a minute. There's a different part of your brain that we see that looks structurally different for people. Now, we don't know if that's like, okay, is that because we engaged in this eating disorder behavior and we rerouted and rewired, or is that because this is just a functional brain or a structural brain change that is different and people are born that way? We don't know that. And that's really not even that important, because what we can change and what we can do is change the environment and change the thing that is frequently activating the disordered behavior.
Right.
So those are things we can change and work on and do, and we know that we can restore healthy functioning for everybody. All the research backs that up.
That's awesome, because in my head when I'm asking these questions, and it seems a little pedantic and maybe hair splitting, but there are people who just really hang their hat on certainty, right? And they really just really want to know. It's like, well, you may never get to.
Yeah.
And you have to learn to be at peace with that, and that's part of embracing mystery, and there's ways you can practice that, which bring you to peace. So a person who levels up to what you guys do, partial hospitalization, you don't have a residential program, right?
No, we don't.
Partial hospitalization would be the next highest. That would be how often? What's it look like? Are they in touch with medical professionals. I presume everybody is.
Yes.
Explain the different levels there.
Yeah. So, well, to speak to the medical treatment piece first, we have a whole team, a comprehensive team. So we have registered dietitian, we have a primary care provider, an internist who's working on things. We have a psychiatrist, and we have the psychotherapists. So every single one of those components is critical when you struggle with an eating disorder to move toward that recovery process or that recovery place. For partial hospitalization,